Welcome back to another episode of the Health Detective Podcast by Functional Diagnostic Nutrition. My name is Evan Transu, aka Detective Ev, and I will be your host for today's show. Episode, oh my gosh, I'm coming off like multiple recordings. I believe 322 of the Health Detective Podcast. I hope I don't have to correct myself there. And we're going to be focusing today not necessarily on some crazy health story, but we're giving something out there to the coaches, the practitioners, something that you guys can actually utilize with your clients and maybe yourself as well. So I will read our guest's bio and we will get right into this. Matty Lansdown is a scientist, nutritionist, and an emotional eating and self-sabotage coach that specializes in helping women get control of their emotional binge and overeating. Starting out in the field of nutritional epigenetics and spending several years working in hospitals as part of a disease research team, Maddie believes that most disease and illness is not due to bad luck, but as a result of poor nutrition and lifestyle choices. Yes. Maddie's extensive experience allowed him to uncover the deeper challenge people have with health, which isn't about calories or kale, but in fact, mindset and behavior change. Having been on his own personal development journey, Maddie is now super passionate about showing people how to level up their health so that their healthy habits and the best food choices are easy and natural. Likewise, Maddie's weekly podcast, How to Not Get Sick and Die, provides his followers and clients with a deep dive into nutrition and how to develop healthy habits that last. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Evan, thanks so much. I'm excited to talk to the audience and have a conversation with you.
Yeah, and so I don't want to speak out of a place of ignorance, but just to confirm, you don't have any kind of crazy health journey, right? Like you weren't diagnosed with some autoimmune or cancer or anything like that, right?
No, I wasn't. I worked in a cancer hospital.
Perfect. All right. We're glad that you don't have it. It's kind of refreshing on this show because normally people come in with stuff like that. But you did mention the personal development journey in your bio. And so, Maddie, normally my first question is around when did your health journey start and what did that look like? But I'd like to know, actually, in your case, when did the personal development journey start for you and what did that look like? What provoked that?
Yeah, so I guess there is a slight element of the work that I do now being inspired by my own journey with that challenge, and so the personal development journey started. So throughout my 20s, I had a long-term relationship for 9 years, and at some point in that journey, my partner told me at the time, "I don't think your upbringing was very normal," because I've always been a really extrovert, sort of always a lot, and always eaten lots of food and lots of sugar, and I just sort of used the excuse that I was a young man that goes to the gym and plays sport and I needed lots of energy. That same kind of narrative that modern parents use for their children that can't stop eating cornflakes, fundamentally it's the wrong nutrition. And so what that sort of introduced me to was the investigation into my own life story of why am I so extra? Why am I so intense and the loudest voice in the room, and the person that's sort of always demanding attention and approval from everybody. And I was a musician and I did some really, really cool stuff on some really big stages around the world with music. But it was sort of never enough. And then I went into my own sort of history. And so I grew up in an extremely violent home. And until my partner at the time introduced me to the concept that my upbringing wasn't necessarily normal or good, or produced a good outcome on the other side, I just thought it was discipline. I just thought I was being disciplined and that was that. And, I sort of held the same view, which is like, if kids are out of line, you whack them into line. And it wasn't until I began unraveling that I started to realize that, oh, I have a total binge eating disorder, basically, or I'm a sugar addict, and those sort of terms are relatively interchangeable, or I'm an emotional eater, all three of those terms are sort of, relatively interchangeable. But that's when I realized that every time that like emotion, that sadness, anger, frustration would come up within me, it would be something that sort of clashed with my self-image of the fun, happy, excited guy. And I was always the life of the party. And, I'm always I'm always the guy that knows everyone all the time. Everyone's my best friend. And then every time this stuff came out of me, the only person that would ever see it or be victim to my just messy set of emotions would be my partner in privacy. And so it created extreme turmoil in that relationship. And so the personal development journey was actually motivated by the idea of me wanting to be a good, stable partner, which uncovered the fact that I used food in order to manage my emotional state. And I've never had a weight issue that never produced a disease. I was young enough to get onto it at a point that it didn't turn into anything crazy. But it was the complete transformation of me through all of my 20s from a sort of an unstable, messy boy into a man.
Nice. Okay, well, certainly there's a psychological journey there, so I'm glad I asked that question. It's really interesting. One thing I wanted to be clear about when you said at one point you grew up in a violent household, then you said you looked at it as discipline. So just for clarity's sake, do you mean for a good portion of your life you interpreted what happened in your childhood as discipline when in fact most people would interpret it as violence, or did you know something was wrong when you were younger as well?
Yeah, no, you nailed it.
Okay.
So I thought it was just discipline, and this was normal. And I mean, growing up, I knew that all of my friends knew that my mum was the strict mum, and
Mhm.
like my house was the strict house. But I just didn't understand how bad it was.
Okay. Got it. And I think it's a conceptually common theme, not directly with what you're talking about, but this idea that people grow up in a way that they believe it's normal, right? And I'm happy to say this, even though some of my family members listen to the show, but we've thankfully overcome a lot of this. There was a period where, for almost 5 or 6 years, and I'm not comparing this to violence, to be clear, I'm showing an example of how something can seem normal and you realize it's actually not, where everyone was so unhealthy, so freaked out, all this stuff. I mean, every single day for years we're yelling and screaming at each other about something. And they're scary, right? This last 20, 30 minutes, people are slamming things, everyone's screaming, they're saying things they don't mean. I'm involved in this. And it hurts the other people and it hurts you. And I just kind of thought, because everyone, if you asked your family members argue, I'd say, well, of course. What I did not realize until I got older and started looking at other places is, okay, yes, most people yell sometimes. Certainly, family members get into disagreements and arguments. No, they don't necessarily scream and say terrible things to each other for 20, 30 minutes minimum a day, starting the day like that for 5 or 6 years straight. That's a problem. So I
Yeah.
think it's actually very humbling and hard to process eventually that, hey, this is an abnormal thing. So, you speak about this in such a confident and clear way now. So it's almost like, knowing you for just a few minutes, it's obvious when someone's actually done the work and speaking from a place of authenticity. So I really appreciate that. But going back to when you first had this realization, and I'm sorry, I know this is not necessarily the main point of today, but I go into story mode too easily on this. I have to ask, when you did come to this realization and your partner pointed it out, was this something that you were open to at the time, or was there a little bit of resistance when this was first brought up?
Yeah, it's a good question. And just to touch on your previous point,
Sure, sure.
I'm an open book. So you can ask me
Thank you.
anything. I'm,
Awesome.
I'm happy to be honest and vulnerable and real and say the stuff that most people don't say.
Mhm.
But at the time, I think there was a pattern in our relationship of me really letting her down in really big ways and being really selfish. So by the time we got to that sort of point, and she was, a beautiful, stable, lovely, maternal, feminine woman that was just fantastic and still, one of the most important people in my life.
Mhm.
But it had gotten to the point where there must be a reason. And so we were sort of in investigation mode, and I was open to being in an investigation mode. And the interesting thing is, as you probably know, Evan, and all of your listeners, it's like as soon as you identify some kind of psychological thing or trauma, it then got worse for years as I started to unpack it and pull it apart and confront what was going on. And don't get me wrong, for years throughout my 20s, it probably took me about 7 years to go through lots of therapy and events and mushroom journeys and all sorts of stuff to be able to get on the other side of it. But during that time, I had a lot of anger and disdain for the people in my family. And I went through that phase of the journey. And now I'm very much on the other side of it, which is understanding that they were doing the best that they can, and showing that empathy and understanding. It doesn't mean it was okay. It doesn't mean I'm fine with it. But it does mean that I understand that we've all hurt people. We've all made poor choices. And I really struggle to believe that there's very few evil people in the world,
Yeah.
And I think everyone's just a symptom of their own upbringing in their own life. And so yeah, but in the beginning, I was open to it because I was interested in being better and performing better, but not for the right reasons. I had massive approval issues because I felt like my mum didn't love me,
Okay.
right? And so all of my drive was like, oh, I'm a bit broken. Oh my God, I can be better. This isn't good enough. So it was coming from this like egotistical place of wanting to be better and perform better, and like, oh, I could get more approval and more love and attention from everybody around me, which explains why I was a musician on stage in front of thousands of people, right? It's like everybody loved me.
Where does one draw the line between a competitive spirit and the validation side? And I assume this will probably indirectly lead us into the core of the conversation, but I'm curious how that nuance is figured out, because it's like, okay, there really are just competitive people. There really are super extroverted people. So how do we identify whether or not it's problematic?
That's a great question. And that's something that I think about regularly, because a lot of people's motivation, like, comes from struggle, right? In any field. And so I'm not 100% sure if it's all a bad thing, because it can produce great outcomes. For me, it's given me the ability to communicate, to negotiate, to think really fast. Like, these are skills that I had to develop in the mess of my childhood in order to figure out safety, right? And so, maybe I don't know, maybe trauma and suffering is the way that we find our gift, Like, I'm not sure, but, in order for us to all have hope that this is all worth something, we have to pull some kind of positive perspective out of it. And so, you might see some of the dudes in the army that are just absolute savages. And, I think of David Goggins, and it's like, I'm happy that guy goes to war. Obviously he doesn't anymore, but they're the kind of men you want on the front line of war. Maybe they're not the kind of men that you want in a marriage, but but the personalities that are produced have utility, is my point. And getting those personalities in the right setting, whether that be hyper competitive sport, or whether that be in the army, or whatever it might be, is a great service to society. However, there's obviously consequences to those personalities, maybe in close, intimate relationships or in family environments. I think David Goggins had 5 wives, right?
Oh, really? Wow.
um, yeah. So the point is that I don't know where that line is between just it being beneficial to the individual or being just hyper competitive versus the idea of it being trauma or needing to heal. Because maybe if everybody totally heals, nobody's got the strength to go to war, and maybe no one's got the strength to do anything.
Yeah. It wasn't quite 5, but married twice and currently engaged. So yes,
All
it's
right.
quite a few. And I think he's only like early 40s. So yeah, wow. But to your point, it's kind of interesting that you brought up David Goggins, because I love psychology, and I'm not a psychologist, but I just love reading studies, and I have a few textbooks because I'm a nerd, and I think we share that sentiment, it seems. But it's interesting. Apparently, a lot of the special forces, particularly the Navy SEALs, actually, if you are to test them psychologically, they actually measure higher on psychopathic traits. It's not to say that they are all literal psychopaths, but there is a
Mm.
spectrum to this to some degree. And it means that if you took a random person out of the public versus a random person out of the SEAL team, these are generally people that little harder on the empathy, little disagreeable. They need that excitement and stimulation. And so you wonder, how the hell do people get into this stuff? It's like, well, we actually know that the brains of these individuals do not feel excitement in the same way. They're highly prone to boredom. And so what's crazier than doing the toughest challenges in the world and being sent over to take out people? And perhaps that's probably, if you are dealing with some level of that, perhaps that's probably the best outlet for that type of personality, right? You're hurting another
Yeah.
person, but you're doing it for hopefully the greater good. We could have a whole podcast on whether or not
Yes.
it's for the greater good. I'm not going to go there. So eventually, really interesting story, by the way. Eventually, this led to you developing a passion and a niche now for helping women specifically, it seems, with this eating stuff. So how did it evolve from your stuff and the trauma to, hey, that's what I now do as work?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I very rarely have the conversation we've just had on a podcast,
Okay.
because the way that I actually got there predominantly was the fact that, so graduated from uni and I grew up in the countryside. I was the first person in my family to go to university. And so I got a degree and I graduated as a molecular biologist. And I was basically, like medicine and science is the greatest thing that's ever existed. And, very staunch in my beliefs that, naturopaths are hippies and Chinese medicine's like people stuck in the past and all this kind of ridiculous, naive stuff that I thought in my early 20s. And so I worked firstly in a nutritional epigenetics lab surrounded by dietitians and nutritionists, and we were working with elite athletes and Olympians and really high level colleges that would test their teams genetically, and we're using very science based ideas in order to get these people to perform better. And then I ended up in cancer research for 7 years, leukemia and lymphoma, and that's where it really began, because I started to realize that nobody ever talked about the cause. 7 years of meetings, of morbidity and mortality meetings and reviewing death, because my molecular biology degree was a forensic one. And nobody ever talked about the cause of disease. And so many people were negatively affected by the medication, by the chemotherapy, by the radiation. And so naively, what seems naively, was that I was just asking questions of my professors like, what are their diets like? Maybe it's not about the molecular SNP difference between the two of them, and maybe they've both eaten McDonald's for 50 years, and I would just get laughed at all the time, like, oh, Matty's 25, what does he know, and I, for some reason, most other people, I guess, generally speaking, would be put back in their box and they'd be like, oh yeah, that is a silly question. My professor said it was a silly question. So back to the research papers. And I just never let go of it, because every day in clinic, I would walk through clinic to collect everyone's samples for research, and visibly everybody was overweight. Depending which clinic you're in. If you're in the clinic of sort of new cancer patients, everyone's overweight or obese. If you're in the clinic of cancer patients that have been around a long time, everyone's almost underweight, because the chemo and radiation has taken such a toll. And so I thought, well, if everybody's overweight, and the research shows that being overweight or obese is a precursor to, diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, modern chronic diseases, then I should become a nutritionist. And so I did. I became a nutritionist, and I thought, I'm just going to get these people skinny and they'll be fine. And then what I found was that this is the next step, is where I ended up where I am now, which is that I did that for a few years, and I spoke at wellness events and retreats and conferences, and to lots of different socioeconomic brackets as well. And I realized that I've never met a single person, no matter how wealthy or poor they are, that didn't know meat and vegetables was a good idea. The same with the cancer patients in the hospital. Right? That everybody generally, maybe the specific diet template that was right for them that they didn't know, but they generally knew that stuff that grew out of the ground or on a farm was good. And so I thought, why aren't people doing it? And that's what I realized. In a world of absolute excessive addictive substances like sugar, it's the psychology and the personal management of the relationship with food that's the challenge, and that's how I got here, which is, people know generally what to eat, because half of them have done 25 diets over their life. But it's the question, why don't I do what's good for me, that they struggle with. And that's how I got here. And I think fundamentally answering that question can help all sorts of people in different health situations. Because I've worked with cancer patients that, even in the face of cancer and death diagnoses, they're just like, oh, well, so be it, or whether it be autoimmune or, whatever. We've all got these tendencies to self-sabotage and to be victim to our life perspective or identity or narrative. And so that's where I ended up, basically, on that journey.
Okay. This is one, I love the jumping of careers, and pretty impressive ones at that. Very interesting person that I'm talking to today. So with that said, I think this goes beyond even health, right? Because there are obviously people at the highest levels of life in every subject and category and area of study that do genuinely know more than the average person. However, I think, and I would argue, that if I asked the average 25 to 30-year-old, and certainly anyone older than that, what's one thing better that you could do with your finances? I think they could answer that. What's one thing better that you could do in your relationships? I think they could answer that. And it's interesting that this came up today, because I posed this before to myself and then others. It's like, we kind of always know what to do. Now, do I know how to be a high-level Wall Street person that knows how to invest in certain stocks at the right time? No, I don't know that financial stuff. But do I know that probably I should budget this a little more? Maybe I should save here. Yeah, I think most of us do, and yet we find ourselves not doing it. So I
Mm.
think if we talk about the solution there, I think this could actually affect people in a lot of positive ways. So, not to give you too simple of a question, but what the heck is the answer? Or how do we at least start getting to the answer where we are walking around as these very intelligent animals, but still animals that are still kind of operating on autopilot a lot of times? How do we go from that, knowing what we should do, to actually doing it? What's the first step?
Well, I think the first step is understanding why you are the way you are, because fundamentally we're in a situation that we're in today, all of us, because whatever habits or lifestyle choices we are making on a day to day basis, in our mind, have more benefits than drawbacks.
Mhm.
Whenever that's out of balance, we always go towards whatever has more benefits. It might not look like a benefit to the other person on the outside, but it's a benefit to us. And I can give you a really extreme example which highlights what I mean here. And I have this conversation quite often, which is quite sad. So I work with a lot of women, predominantly women that are overweight, varying degrees of overweight, and we've discovered in their journey, or they've started to learn that all the yo-yo dieting they've ever done is a self-sabotage mechanism. And the reason for that is because there's actually more benefits than drawbacks to them being overweight. And one of them that is extremely powerful, and one that very few people talk about out loud, is that the number of women that have been in some degree sexually harassed or sexually abused is really high. And so what happens is that they start to lose weight and they end up in a body that's now getting attention. They're getting attention from men again, and they're getting maybe comments, or even just lovely comments like, "Oh, you're starting to look really great," and they're being noticed. Whereas before they weren't noticed, and that meant safety. So the benefit to being overweight is I'm not attractive to men, and I don't get attention because many years ago this awful thing happened to me, and as a result of that, I've been protecting myself by being in the shadows and being hidden from everybody by this layer of weight or this layer of body fat that's covering my body. So the benefits and drawbacks thing doesn't always look like a benefit to somebody else, because you might walk into a practitioner's office and they would be like, being overweight is not a benefit, of course, right? From a health perspective. And so there's all of these benefits and drawbacks that we weigh up in our mind, either consciously or unconsciously, as to the decisions we make each day. And then they just become automated habits over time. And many people either didn't know what was going on in the beginning, or have been doing it so long, they're so disconnected to the initial thing that happened. And it might not be that big, by the way. No, I don't believe that absolutely everyone's got trauma. And there's a lot of sugar addiction research that shows people go looking for trauma and don't really find anything. And so it's not always a big trauma. It can just simply be, oh, I've been exposed to $1 billion sugar marketing industry for 40 years, whose sole job is to, get you hooked on their products.
Sure.
And it's layers of different things. But I think we start by understanding what's going on right now. So a self-awareness phase, and why am I choosing this over choosing what I know I should be doing.
You mentioned, and I actually really appreciate this. You mentioned that it's not always trauma. And I do think it's so tough because a lot of times it is, right? But a lot of
Yeah.
times there's some people that live by that narrative because that's what happened to them. And they think everyone's dealing with this and that's always the issue. So part of the problem though with trauma is it's not necessarily obvious. Like in your case, thank God you had this outside source in your partner that was able to say, no, this isn't normal. But there's plenty of things that even if you had an outside source are not necessarily inherently obvious. So I guess one of the things I'm sorry, because I know this is probably a case by case thing, but how can someone know if they're hiding trauma that's not even conscious versus, okay, they are really just a victim of this marketing machine that is the sugar industry, where scientists are sitting in a lab trying to figure out what tastes perfectly so that you keep eating more? Because that's pretty crazy in its own right. So, how do you figure that out?
I think the first and really easy step that anyone listening can do is go back in time, and before the habit that you're doing that's producing an unhelpful health outcome or experience of your life, when did it not exist and where did it begin? And what there's usually a window of time that it appeared, and what happened then. It's like timeline therapy, right? It's going through all of the different situations in somebody's life where there was a pivot, there was a change. And so, for many people, they'll look back and be like, oh, it started at uni. And see, this is another example of something that's not a trauma. A lot of people need sweets or candies or lollies on their desk at work or during an assignment. I definitely did during university the first time. I had a can of Mother. I was definitely not a nutritionist at this time, so Mother's like a guarana-filled stimulant drink, and a pack of chocolates, and I had to wait till really late at night when there's nobody else to talk to because I'm super social, and I was looking after myself. It was my dopamine hit to get me through the insufferable assignment that I had to do. And now people, do the same thing with their work, and we discover actually it's a feeling of incompetence that comes up there, and they're unsure about the task, because tasks we're good at and we're focused on, we're just in the zone, we do it, we nail it, we know we can get it out of the way. But things we're a little bit unsure about, some people go and get some help to get through that, some dopamine source, which might be some chocolate or some candy, right? And so that's another non-trauma based coping mechanism, and it's just simply, it's super easy to cope with sugar because we live in the Western world. So I think you've got to be retrospective, and that's the first part that I work with people, which is we don't change anything. We look back on the past. When did the habit start, and what was going on before that and after that to develop that habit as some kind of coping management mechanism that's now supportive of what you believe is more benefits than drawbacks.
Okay, and obviously there would be a major advantage to working with someone like you, but to guide our audience along, because they're going to be listening and resonating with some of this. So I hate using myself as the guinea pig all the time, but I'll at least do it so we can kind of use an example to some degree. I've shared this on the podcast before. One of the things that I had to identify that is really still hard for me to comprehend, but I'm almost positive this has to be true. So, Matty, I had a bunch of health conditions, but one of them was severe cystic acne. And
Mm-hmm.
I actually nailed down my health to the point that I didn't meet the diagnostic criteria for any of the other health issues, but I still had some acne. Now, on one hand, that is one of the trickier things to actually fully resolve. It's pretty easy to break out. Most people can do that if they ate the wrong thing or, drank
Yeah.
alcohol a bunch, whatever. But I caught myself eventually doing things at certain times that I knew, because I was already studying my own body for a while, I knew would lead to a breakout. And I'm like, what's going on here? And so, similar to how you talked about a woman might, not every woman, obviously, but a woman that is overweight might self sabotage because of some of the trauma they experienced, when they were someone that would get approached more than they might currently be getting approached. I found for myself that there was insecurities in other areas, but acne was so obviously something that someone would reject in dating or
Ah,
like social situations, that if I had the acne, it meant that if I was rejected in the situation, I wouldn't have to look at the other things. Again, I'm going psychologist on myself here, so I can't verify this, but I'm almost positive that that is true. So let's say someone's listening and they're coming up with an aha moment similar to the one that I just did, but they're like, what the hell do I do next? Where would you start with someone like me? Because thankfully, I think I'm on the other side of this mostly, probably 90% of the way there, but I wasn't at one point. So let's say they actually have the awareness around it. Then what do we do to help get this better?
yeah, that's a good question. So, thank you for sharing that. I think that's so interesting that you were able to self-identify what's going on there. Because, in my experience with emotional eaters, sugar addicts, there's the core theme for most of them is a feeling of unworthiness, that they're not worthy of love, attention, care, respect, decency, that type of thing. And so, the way that they might access all of the feelings of love and nurture and care is often through sugar or wine, um, or alternatively, they'll use those same tools to self-punish, right? So in that instance, I think the first thing that we would do is firstly identify it, which you've already done, but then figure out, it might be about building your self-esteem about the other stuff, like you are worthy, and you're using this sort of, let's say, because you use the term like breakout, so it's not always there, right? So if it is there, then you've got an excuse for why things didn't work, right? And then if it's not there, it's like, oh, am I as a person being rejected? And rejection never feels good. We've both been men in the dating game, right? It's like
It's hard
it's
enough
the
out there, man, let alone with
yeah,
breakouts. Like, come on.
totally. So it would be just figuring out, are there other parts of you that need work that you're ignoring? Or is it a matter of being like, oh, I'm worthy of, love. And I'm also not responsible for other people's life experience as well, in the sense that, not everyone's going to love us. Not everyone's going to find us attractive. And that hits the ego at the time, and can even drive people to go and cope with that emotional experience with sugar. But it would be just figuring out, is it about ignoring the things that need work, or is it about having a fundamental acceptance that you are worthy and just not everybody is meant to be together forever?
Mhm. I think that's a hard thing for a lot of us to accept because on one end, I mean, again, okay, let's go back to the thing that we were talking about with improving finances, improving health. On one end, we can do that with ourselves. Like I could look at infinite things that I can continue to improve about myself until the day that I leave this earth. So that's true, but it can also simultaneously be true that I am worthy of, having friends. I'm worthy of having love in the state that I am in. I think that's a very tough thing for people. I know I've struggled with that, unknowingly at the time, but certainly I've struggled with it at times. So I guess how can we help someone accept where they're at while still understanding that it's perfectly okay and healthy even to continue to progress in areas of our lives?
I think there's a really sort of cute story or metaphor that I use to explain this exact situation. So many people, if they remember back to the first car that they owned, and this is one of the first questions that I ask my group clients because it's really fun. It evokes a lot of fun memories, which is, what was your first car and what's a memory about it? And a lot of people think back to this $500 or $2,000 car that was a bit broken and had dents in it, and that they went on these crazy adventures when they were 18 or 19 or 20, and it evokes all of these really positive memories. However, you knew at the time, even though you loved this car and it was cheap and it was broken and it always broke down, you loved it, but you always wanted a better car, right? You always, like, if somebody gave you a Ferrari, you would have been stoked, right? Because and it's not like you were cheating on the other car. It's just you were leveling up your life, right? And it doesn't mean that the chapter that you had with that, that small car or that terrible car that broke down all the time that created these fun memories. It doesn't mean that now you hate that car. It's just you're improving, right? And it's the same with our own body. We can love ourselves and care for ourselves and give ourselves some respect and say, hey, you've done a lot of cool things with this body, and we can do some more cool things if we upgrade and change and transform. Equally, it's okay to stay where you are if that's where you want to be. Sometimes that's the journey that I go on with clients too, is that through the process, they realize, oh, I'm doing this for everybody else. I'm here working with you because my family doesn't accept me, or society says that I'm too big. And for the individual person, my opinion of their health status is irrelevant. It's about them realizing, oh, I'm fine where I am. I'm fine with the car that I bought when I was 18. And some people in society are. They're still driving the car that they bought many years ago, and that's totally fine if that's their choice, right? So I think, it's up to that individual. It's okay to love and respect yourself and want to get better. And arguably, in the space of health, showing yourself self-respect is the pursuit of physical, mental, spiritual betterment.
I'm so glad you put that last little bit on because I was like, oh man, I need to go check myself again because I drive my fiance crazy because I'm like, babe, this is never going to stop. Like we're always going for the next thing. And I'm very happy in my life. Like I try to have a genuine appreciation for the things that have already been accomplished and the things that I have, but I just love the game, man. I love going for the next thing and just seeing how good can we get at something? How far can we take something? So I appreciate that last part there. Now, for our practitioners listening, of course, if they have clients that are struggling to maintain their habits, one of the things that they could do is send them to Matty, and I hope that they do that eventually. But of course, we wanted to come on today and hopefully give them something that they can take away from this. So if I am a practitioner that hasn't studied this anywhere near as in depth as you, like I'm a functional health practitioner, I usually help them with the dietary side and we run the labs. And I'm finding that I have certain clients that, they just fly right through it. You give them the lab results, they're like, bam, man, I'm good to go. And then these others are straggling along for months. Is there something that's easy enough to teach on a podcast like this with limited time that our practitioners can apply in their coaching sessions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just simply understanding the habits of somebody, because you can learn a lot from the food choices and the habits and the daily sort of patterns that people go through to understand why they're in the situation they're in. Because I think a lot of health and wellness intervention is focused just on the future. And this is very much the case in, when you come in with a diagnosis, it's like change everything, move forward to a better place. But if we don't understand how we got here, then we don't know what to change. It's like looking at the car and saying the car's broken. It's like, well, the car's not broken. If we lift the hood, we'll identify that the water pump is broken or that the fuel pump is broken. So which is, the idea of doing labs, right? It's figuring out which part of the car, which part of the human is actually the thing that needs attention. So I think from a habit and lifestyle perspective, understanding what their day-to-day life looks like, and also understanding that some of the stuff they're embarrassed and ashamed about, like the chocolate that they smash every day at 3 p.m., might not be something they tell you. It might take a little while before that information comes out. But equally, and coming from a lab standpoint, is, in order to do good psychological work, we need a good nervous system and brain, right? And so it's never just mindset work. There's always a physical element that we need to support the microbiome that talks to the brain. We need to support the nervous system. We need to support the brain so that all of these emotions have good tracks to run on, right? Because we can be sort of conceptually, we can get things, and there's a lot of logic involved when it comes to like, oh yeah, Matty, I understand that makes sense, but emotions aren't logical. So we need to give them a really solid foundation when it comes to nutrition in order to be able to build a strong nervous system and brain. And that's going to involve, first and foremost, sleep. Like making sure people's sleep is good, because that's where we get our brain ready for the next day, of course. Stress management, of course, is going to be a part of that conversation. And then making sure, there's good fat in the diet. And you've got your A, D, E, and K vitamins in there as well that are going to build the nervous system. And so I think that's really important to come from that standpoint. But if you're sitting in front of somebody and you're trying to understand how they got to the situation that they're in, I think asking questions about their habits or their challenges, or doing some timeline therapy to be able to understand, like, oh, okay, so you had a situation happen, which means that you got hooked on wine. You dealt with a divorce 15 years ago, which means you've been drinking every day ever since, right? Or whatever the situation is, because that then allows you to tackle things at the core, which was my initial motivation. I was like, oh, so I can help people with their psychological attachment to food, which then by default will prevent cancer, right?
Yeah.
And that's the kind of idea, is that you want to find the core cause of it rather than just fix the part of the car. It's like, where's this car been? Where did it drive? Did you take it off road and it's not an off road car, right?
It's cool hearing you talk. You're obviously a very intelligent person. I love how this is all one giant science experiment, basically, that you've connected together. And so you're helping people at a super high level, and they might not even realize some of the extra benefits that they would get from getting support from you. One thing I should have asked this earlier, I apologize, is you talked about, and in your bio, it states how you work with people sometimes that are binge eating or dealing with, that's eating disorders, I guess. How do you combine your work with someone that might be more credentialed in it? And what I mean more credentialed, I mean, like, if someone's actually dealing with a legitimate binge eating disorder, they probably legally have to be referred to someone or talk to someone. So how does your work combine with the work that like a therapist might do?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the qualification and credentials that I've got allow me to work with binge eating disorder,
Oh, okay.
and
I'm
then
sorry. I didn't know that.
and then so not everyone, but a lot of people do have bits and pieces of that in their past. However, you've got different types of opinions, obviously, and I'm probably more of the opinion when it comes to binge eating disorder and emotional eating and sugar addiction. For me, they're all kind of the same thing, and it depends on the personality in front of you, and this will be the same for all the people listening. Is it depends on the personality in regards to the strategy you choose to enforce with them, which is that labels are not always helpful. Right? Labels for many people can be like, oh, finally, well, I've just got binge eating disorder, that's why I can't stop eating chocolate, and it becomes this part of their excuse or part of their identification. And if we're starting to identify with these labels in an unhelpful way, which in my experience is a lot of the time, then it's not always a great idea. So many of the people that come through, they'll go through a sales call process, and they'll be recommended, depending on what's going on for them, whether or not they should have a psychologist along for the journey. So we're very diligent in making sure that people that have some really dark stuff going on that might need some extra support, that they should go and see a psychologist or a therapist of some kind of thing. But it inevitably, and most coaches will find this, there's some aspect of it which is just thera coaching.
Yeah.
Like you can't really coach someone without getting into some deeper stuff. Otherwise that superficial stuff doesn't get many people very far. So yeah, there's definitely a line. Like if we get into some severe trauma stuff, if we get into some severe, bulimia or anorexia. Having said that, I've worked with anorexics that have lost their legs due to their malnutrition, alongside their psychologist as well. So it really is a case by case basis as to how we determine whether or not we are the right people, and we might be the right people as long as you've got a team,
Mhm.
right? But yeah, so it gets really into the weeds as to like what is this individual's particular scenario.
Sure. I apologize for misspeaking on the credentials. I did not realize
Totally
that
cool,
that did
no
that.
problem.
And I sorry to do this, but I take any opportunity I can to talk about the anorexia thing because people always, I think,
Hmm.
even in our space, man, people might just shut up a little bit more about it, but they're still like judging it. They're like, really, you can't eat. That is the mental health condition most associated with fatalities, guys. Like, it is a very real thing.
Yeah.
I mean, you just talked about someone losing their leg. They're not doing that for attention. They're not doing that because, they're, well, I guess, yeah, attention was the word I was looking for. Like, that is a deep thing going on that needs to be worked on. So I'm really curious, out of the people that you have worked with, are there some just like really cool stories or highlights or testimonials, to the degree that you're able to share, for privacy's sake? But I'd love to hear about some people that might have been through, kind of something like you went through. They didn't even realize what was going on. They're struggling in the relationship or something even worse because of it. And then they were able to come to you and finally get to the next phase. So I'd love to hear some success stories.
Yeah, so we do the mindset and psychology first, and then we do the nutrition second, so that we're no longer taking a sort of fad diet approach, and we're not getting sort of that weight centric focus. Losing body fats for most people is a good, healthy thing, but it's about the psychology of the way we approach it. And so we've had loads of people reverse their diabetes, and that came in and realized through the process of the mindset, psychology, past life stuff that, oh, the reason that I graze all day is to cover up emotions. So a lot of people use food, not necessarily just sugar, but just food in the same way that alcoholics use alcohol, which was my story personally, which is that, yeah, anytime stuff came up that I didn't want, it would be bury it to the point that I literally numb out. I'm on such a sugar high, and the crash is so bad that I just end up napping or sleeping. And I did not look like that. I was never overweight or anything, so you would never have guessed. But yeah, we've had a bunch of people put their diabetes into remission. We've had a number of cancer patients we've worked alongside their doctors because of the psychological element of, I've got cancer and I still can't get my food right,
Yeah.
even though I know what I should be doing. And so no one's immune. No one's immune to the susceptibility of wanting a dopamine hit. We call it dopamining. We all go dopamining, which is a term one of my clients came out with, and I was like, oh, that's great. I'm using that. But this pursuit of feeling good and pleasure, we've had so many people lose very large amounts of weight without even looking at weight as the goal. It's just, I'm going to focus on feeling empowered, loving myself, respecting myself, showing up for myself, and being really conscious of every little fork in the road that I get to throughout each day, making a choice. Am I going to go left or am I going to go right? And it's actually okay. So let's say left is okay. It's also the art of permission, because often when we get people that are unwell or overweight, and the second they make a mistake, they're often perfectionists. So
Mm.
they're done for like 6 months, right? They're done. They're off the diet for 6 months. They're off the program. They might not book another session with their practitioner because they're like, oh, I got it wrong. I'll just come back when I figured it out again. And so it's about also understanding that individual is a human, and that the perfectionism within us is unhelpful. And being like, okay, I'm going to consciously choose to eat the chocolate today, but I also know that after I have this chocolate, I'm fine. I'm okay. Now the world hasn't fallen apart. And in order for me to get back to baseline, I've got to do 1, 2, and 3. It might be bone broth, some protein, and, whatever it might be. So it's just that art, whether it be cancer patients, whether it be diabetics, whether it be people losing weight. And we've got, my website, we've got hundreds of testimonials of people doing this, but it's just from that psychological lens as the primary driver that people get to a point where they're like, oh, I want to show up for myself. I want to support myself. And as well, the other interesting thing about working with women and mothers is that often they've been so programmed to put everybody else first, that the idea of, actually looking after themselves as a priority is such a foreign concept that they feel a lot of guilt about.
Mhm.
And so getting people to a space where it's like, hey, you matter. It's okay to take an hour out of the day, or get a husband or wife or partner, to be able to support you in this phase, and to put boundaries in place with the people around you, and have some difficult conversations to be able to get your needs met. And so all of that is part of the process for anyone on any journey to be able to actually support themselves, because it's very difficult to do things alone. The community and people around you are really important.
What would you say, and I'm asking this to kind of preface asking where people can find you and all that stuff, but what would you say is a core theme or realization that all these people that do come to work with you guys have had? Because I'm hearing this from the outside. I'm like, wow, the cancer patients, you got people with, more uh, traditional things that you would associate with an eating problem, right? Like binge eating or anorexia. But
Mhm.
obviously, they must have something in common. They must have come to some realization to then reach out and work with you. So, what is the thing that they all have in common, or the realization that they came to that makes them reach out?
So if they don't listen to my podcast and they've slowly been educated into understanding from me, then it's that I've been on 20 diets for 30 years, and nothing's changed, or I'm in a worse situation. And across that time, I've just gained more and more and more and more weight, and I might have developed, all sorts of intolerances and issues, from the extreme juice cleanses to the multiple day fasts, and the all of the actions that they're taking to try and get, skinny, basically. And so sort of my person's usually 40, 50, 60, and they're like, I'm so done with the yo-yo dieting, and I realize that I come off the other side and go back to the person I used to be. It's clearly about something more or deeper. I'm getting it all wrong. So the common theme in everyone that I work with, or most people, is that they're so done with short-term diets that restrict.
Okay. It's kind of a wild thing, it's amazing that people come to that realization at all, but you just described, I mean, they've been here for a while on this earth, right? 40, 50,
Yeah.
60. It's not like it's your first day or first week. It's kind of interesting how it's such a human experience to lack some of the self-awareness around this and actually do something about it. I don't want to end on a negative note, but I still, it's hard for me to comprehend this, because I had an aunt who measured, because long story short, she was in the gifted program at school. So we actually knew her IQ. It was about a 1 in 10,000. So one of the smartest people that I probably knew. And
Wow.
she got diagnosed with cancer, and she ended up leaving behind 2 teenage kids and
Oh,
her husband. And then, of course, the rest of the family. And I'm like the health guy, right? So it's not like I imposed it too strongly on her, but I said, hey, if you need me to get you connected to anyone, I'll send a message, I'll call a number. Like, I can get you connected to the best holistic cancer people in this country, and you'll be good to go, most likely. And she said, thank you. And I never heard from her about that topic for 3 years. And she eventually passed away from the cancer. And I could not comprehend how someone so intelligent was able to ignore completely the health side of this. I mean, and I'm not talking about going full out functional diagnostic nutrition practitioners, even. I mean, like you kind of said, the meat and veggies thing, like just understanding that maybe we shouldn't be drinking red wine right now, at the family party, because you're dealing with cancer, or like the breads and all this crap. So I'm getting to a question here, and I think it's the opposite of what I just asked. So that was the core personality trait and theme of the people that come to you. What do you think is a core theme of the people that allow themselves to reject getting help in this area to the point that it actually takes them to death?
that's a good question. I think my experience is, because I've got the cancer background as well, and I've also done some specific cancer nutrition education as well, is that simply we live in a world where Western medicine is the driving force, and people trust that. Like, and I mean, not to open a can of worms, but especially being here in Melbourne, Australia, the most lockdown city in the world during COVID, we saw how much people just believed, right? We're in Western medicine. And so what I mean by that is that I often get people's mums and friends and everybody that knows me, like they finally get them in front of me after their third or fourth relapse, right? After they're like, oh, chemo and radiation didn't get me there.
Wow. Okay.
And so I think most people just trust the system, and there's lots of reasons to trust the system. Western medicine's done a lot of fantastic things, but I think people just think, Well, there's this huge behemoth of an industry right in front of me. I've been to the doctor many times. The doctor knows where I should go, and I trust the doctor or doctors in general in, let's say the Western world, the UK, the Australia, the US, Canada. And so then we've got this group of hippies over here, which might embody you and I, Evan, that we show up as, that have got all of these alternative ideas, and I've never really heard about them very much. They're coming from people who've got negative opinions about the doctors I believe in, and so I think at the core, it's just a trust issue, and I think it's a completely rational one because we need to trust the systems that exist. Otherwise, society's in anarchy. But yeah, I think most people just think, well, if and my professor actually said this to me, and he was like, Matty, if nutrition was the answer, we'd already have figured it out. And I think most people think the same thing. It's like, if nutrition or supplements or Chinese medicine was the answer, we would have cured cancer already. So yeah, people don't end up often in front of me until their second, third, fourth relapse, and I'm like, it might be too late at this point.
Yeah, well, and fair enough. I think it's a really good perspective because, if I look at my aunt, it's like, well, yeah, no crap. She didn't have 3 or 4 chances, right? So not everyone's going to get those same amount of chances. And with that,
Yeah.
it's a gamble. And I think, as extreme as my health conditions were at a certain time, I've never been met with something that I believed I was going to pass away from soon. I never thought
Mhm.
that. And so I can only imagine what that would be like. And I genuinely do empathize with it. Like, if you're given that kind of diagnosis, that could make even a very alternative person go into such a fear mode and such a
Yeah.
paralysis that you're just like kind of following orders. So, definitely interesting. So, ideally, people that are listening to this and know that this might be a problem for them would be open to working with someone like you before this becomes a bigger problem. So, if you guys related to any of this stuff today, definitely check out Matty's stuff. And where can they find you? Please shout out the name of the podcast again, website, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so How to Not Get Sick and Die is the podcast. We had Reed actually on there recently, which was
Nice.
fantastic. So he's lovely to have a conversation with. So check out that. Podcast is the main place that I hang out on the internet. And then other than that, my website, which is just mattylansdown.com. So come and hang out. If you've got challenging clients that you might want to collaborate on, we can definitely do that. So that would be awesome.
Excellent. All right. And then the signature question on the Health Detective podcast, my friend, to finish us out today is, if we could give you a magic wand and you could wave it and you could force all of us to start doing one thing for our health, or you could force us all to stop doing one thing for our health, what is the one thing that you get us to do?
Stop eating sugar. I think whether people have psychological, emotional literacy or not, stopping sugar would be one of the most powerful things that society could do. And I think we'd see a massive reduction in a lot of mental health stuff, ADD, ADHD, anxiety, depression. I think we would get rid of a lot of that stuff overnight if we could all just stop.
And hey, if you try to stop and you can't, you know who to call, MattyLansdown.com. All right. Thank you
Thanks,
so much
man.
for coming on today. I love the energy. So obvious that you're a podcast host as well. I feel like we could have done this for 10 hours together. So I appreciate your time today.